Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this listening session for the Traffic Coordination System for Space, or TraCSS, being built by the Office of Space Commerce. Today, our listening session is going to be on space data standards and formats, specifically on conjunction data messages, or CDMs. Some general housekeeping for those of you who haven't joined us before. The listening session will be a total of 1 hour. This will be recorded and posted online to the TraCSS website afterwards. We will be taking feedback from different attendees during, there will be a brief presentation by myself and Dr. Diane Poster. Afterwards, we will be having a feedback session. While we won't be answering questions to different feedback or questions posed, any questions given during the feedback session will be sent back to our technical team for consideration, especially as we're developing the architecture and making different design choices for the traffic coordination system for space. Participants who raise their hand to provide verbal feedback during this feedback session will have 3 minutes each to provide verbal feedback. Additionally, written comments can be submitted per the guidelines in the document that was posted both on the TraCSS website online, where many of you likely registered, and also described if you look at the handouts tab in GoToWebinar, the document is also posted there. And it will also be posted in the chat as well for those who need a link to the document. And written comments can also be sent to the tracs.commerce@noaa.gov email address regarding some of the specific questions posed either during this listening session, or if you wish to provide offline comments directly to the TraCSS team, that can be done via the email as well. And this is the third in a series of what will likely be many listening sessions as we continue to develop the TraCSS system and continue to garner feedback from the community for us to take into consideration. First, a little bit of background for those that aren't aware. My name is Christine Joseph. I work with the Office of Space Commerce as a policy advisor, specifically on space situational awareness. And I also support the TraCSS system, which stands for the Traffic Coordination System for Space, which is the civil space situational awareness capability being built by the Office of Space Commerce within NOAA and the Department of Commerce. This graphic is a visual representation of what we're building for TraCSS as a cloud-based system. There will be diverse data sources being pulled into TraCSS, and I won't go too much into detail on this. There's much greater detail on our TraCSS website online, but I do want to mention that TraCSS will be pulling in diverse data sources, utilizing commercial tools and data to provide basic space situational awareness and space traffic coordination safety services. And what is likely of particular interest to the attendees today, and the focus for today's listening session is on one of the specific services or data products being provided by TraCSS, particularly conjunction data messages. So that's visually, it's this arrow going from the user portal out to our external stakeholders, owner-operators, and other entities looking to leverage the TraCSS data and services as well. So I won't, again, there's a lot more detail on our planning and what the architecture and activities around the development for TraCSS is, including the phased buildup and what's being provided in October 2024. And all that can be found on the TraCSS website as well, or in previous recordings that describe the buildup of the TraCSS system. But today, to focus on conjunction data messages, I'm going to be turning it over to my colleague, Dr. Diane Poster, who's a detail lead to the Office of Space Commerce from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. She's been leading a lot of our work around standards and technology standards, particularly that we should be taking into account for the TraCSS system, as we know that has a high impact both operationally and technically for the future TraCSS operator community and user community. And through our technical team, we've developed this proposal, which I'll turn it over to Diane right now to give a little bit more detail on what we're seeking feedback on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christine, and thanks for that great overview and the introduction. And today we're discussing our conjunction data message fields that will be in the conjunction data message or CDM product that TraCSS will be delivering for on-orbit conjunction assessment. TraCSS is proposing to use the format that is recommended by the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems, known as the CCSDS. And in particular, we're looking at the CDM recommended standard, which is 508.0.p1.01, understanding that this version is under formal review right now by the CCSDS. And in fact, it is known that a new version has been posted on the CCSDS website that is a formal review of an update to this version. So just to make everyone aware of that. But at the time that we were drafting our recommendations, this version that we were looking at, the 1.01, the Pink Book version is the one that we were focusing on, and I'll talk a little bit more about the rationale for that in a moment. We did post our proposal of recommendations for these data fields on the website. There's a handout, as Christine mentioned, also in the GoToWebinar window, and it's understood that I'd just like to make it clear that this is a proposal, so this is not a final decision on what TraCSS will be using, and today's listening session will help us receive feedback for the proposal. Next slide, please. So as a background area, in terms of our conjunction data message evaluation, we actually started with the Department of Defense Space Data Space Flight Safety Handbook, which does provide use of the CCSDS Pink Book version, which I referenced in the previous slide, but the actual standard that is published, so to speak, that is not a draft or under review by the CCSDS is the standard number 508.0-B-15, and this is related to that Pink Book that is under review by the CCSDS, but the actual published version, which means that it's no longer under review and is the one that is in practice, so to speak, with respect to the community, is known as a Blue Book. So when we have reference to that in our document, that's what we're referring to is that Blue Book. The CCSDS CDM is actually very useful for exchanging conjunction information data between providers for conjunction assessment results, and also sharing information between spacecraft owners and operators. And what's really nice is that the final product of the conjunction assessment is useful for providing enough information to assess the risk of a collision, and it helps enable the design of collision avoidance maneuvers if those are in fact necessary. Next slide, please. The conjunction information that is in a CCSDS data message for this does have a number of different data types. We do outline those in our proposal, and I just wanted to reference the document that is the Blue Book that I described in the previous slide, as noted here with the link that is cited on the CCSDS public website. It is available at no cost. And this is what is described in our proposal as well, that is in the handout. Next slide. It's important to note that the CCSDS CDM version that I'm talking about is under the 5-year review, which I mentioned, which is the Pink Book that I noted that was just released actually on April 1st on the CCSDS website. If you go under the review tab, that's where you will find that. But even though there is a version that's out there that is in this Pink Book version, the Blue Book version is in use today. And for example, the 18th and the 19th Space Defense Squadron does make use of the CCSDS standard. It is their primary means of notifying an operator of a conjunction assessment. And as I mentioned, a full description of the processes for on-orbit conjunction assessment by the 18th and the 19th Space Defense Squadron is in the Space Flight Safety Handbook for satellite operators. That is available on the web as well, and that is described in our proposal version 1.7, and Appendix C refers to the data fields that we're talking about today. And Appendix C does make use of the Pink Book version that is 1.01, But again, that has just been updated as part of the mandatory 5-year review process that is part of the CCSDS process for developing standards, and that is on the website. It is important to note also that the CCSDS CDM standard is also used by NASA at the Johnson Space Center in support of human spaceflight operations, and also at the Goddard Space Flight Center in support of conjunction risk assessment, risk analysis through their operations known as CARA. Next slide, please. The CDM fields that have been selected for TraCSS will be the primary product for how TraCSS will deliver an on-orbit conjunction assessment. In this presentation, I'll be reviewing 2 tables that are taken from the handout that is online and also in the GoToWebinar window. It's a comprehensive review of the fields that are proposed to be in the TraCSS Phase 1.0 series. It is important to note that the CDM fields, as they're described in the document, are comma-separated variable fields, and that in a particular order is shown in our document, but a message string, it can be customized and vary in length. It doesn't have to be exactly in the example way that is shown in our tables. We also have a second table, which is a table that summarizes fields that have been marked with an asterisk in the proposal, and these are areas where these only have information in the CDM that if the prerequisite input data is available and is distributable by TraCSS. And so we have these marked as an asterisk because the Office of Space Commerce is very interested in receiving feedback about if the operational impacts, what those would be if such information was not included in a CDM. And so that's in table 2. Next slide, please. So in particular, here at the Office of Space Commerce, we're looking for feedback on the following topics with respect to the data fields, on whether the information in this CDM fields is considered proprietary, if there are operational considerations, if the information in certain fields was not available, if the proposed fields are representative of an operationally actionable data set that is assembled for a CDM. Also, we'd like to know if any of the proposed fields are considered to be not necessary. And also, if there are any additional fields that should be included in the proposed list that perhaps are not listed. Next slide, please. So we'll just move into a quick review of these data fields. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I did want to show them how they are presented in the proposal that is online. And moving from left to right in the table that's in the proposal, we have the keyword identified, which is the data type that is in the CDM message. Then in the middle column is a description of those keywords and what those are. So that helps to explain the capability and how that's applied within the CDM. And then in the last column on the right in the table that is in the document and as shown here in the slide is an example of the field string and how that could be presented. So for example, in the first row, it says CCSDS CDM version. So that is the CDM format version in the form of XY, and the example is 1.0. So that refers to the format version that is provided for the CDM. A comment is the second line, and just for example, that could be a comment that could be placed there for reader's information, and the format of that would be in a string as shown in the example on the right. And then the table continues with additional data fields with respect to parameters that are useful for including in a CDM, such as the message ID, the miss distance, the time of closest approach, the TCA, and then and so forth down the line. Next slide, please. The data types begin to expand out, and they range from, for example, collision probability. If that's applicable, then a probability of collision is calculated, known as P lower C, and that's calculated in the values that are shown that can be ranging from a 0.0 to 1.0 as shown in the example, and that is the probability. And then moving down the line from the top of this table, which is slide 2 of 6, we move into screen volumes, and then also to additional information as well about, looks like I have a repeat there of 2 lines, so I apologize about that. But the screen volumes are very important because they provide X, Y, and Z orientation parameters, and very useful in the CDM. Next slide, please. Moving on down the line as we move into the orbit center, which is at the top of the line. That's a keyword provided, and moving on through information such as contact position, operator, organization, and phone and email. Contact information is very important, and it's noted that those fields are repeated for both Object 1 and Object 2 in the assessment. Next slide, please. And then we move into a covariance method, which is a method for how the covariance is calculated. Maneuver capability of the object, and also the reference frame. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Reference frame is something that is of interest with respect to which reference frame there may be a specific preference for. The EME 2000 is one that is suggested as a default, and we welcome thoughts and ideas about that. Next slide. And then moving into object position vectors, X, Y, and Z, as well as things that are in comment fields. And the comment fields are very important because these comment fields may include information that is not characterized in a field within the CCSDS CDM standard. However, we'd like information about how the community feels about information being in comment fields, and if that should be a specific field within a CDM standard or not. So we welcome your thoughts about that. Next slide, please. And then finally, with the wrap up of the table 1, we have a description of covariance matrices, and these are ranging from 1.1 to 6.6. So we welcome comments about that, and if there are thoughts about how those matrices may need to vary, or maybe there are additional ones, we welcome comments about that. Next slide, please. Okay, and then I mentioned that in table 2 for this presentation, we have fields that have an asterisk on, and these will only have information in the CDM if the input data is available to and distributable by TraCSS. So we would like information about your comments about how applicable these are with respect to being provided in the CDM. Next slide, please. In addition to the fields that have asterisks on, we also have in our proposal a summary of additional fields that are noted where I talked about the comments. And again, these are not explicitly in the CCSDS standard, but they are contained as information in a comment field. And so we would like information about thoughts about that structure. And one of the item number 13 here at the bottom of the slide is something that we're proposing as a TraCSS ID, that this would be in the system at the database level. And we welcome thoughts about how a TraCSS ID could be used, whether it's in a comment field or a data field, and those types of thoughts. Next slide, please. So in summary, just to recapture what our recommendations were for TraCSS phase 1.0, we were proposing to include the CCSDS CDM fields, even for those fields that are not published in currently a CDM. We'd like to continue to use the common fields for instances where this is the case until the CCSDS CDM is updated. And updated in the sense that it's published and not in a review mode or under review or any kind of evolutionary state. We'd also like to propose item number 3 to add new keywords for data that the 19th SDS CDM currently has in a common field where there are no existing keywords to help with tagging and indexing and searching features of tracks. And then item number 4 is that we are proposing that we will deprecate tracks comment fields when the CCSDS standard is updated, and as those fields may become available as fields that we don't need to use the comments anymore. And we also propose number 5 that we being the Office of Space Commerce, we will continue to work with the CCSDS on the CDM standard to update it and be part of the navigation working group to help that happen. Next slide, please. Just to recapture what we're looking for comments on, whether the information in the CDM fields is considered proprietary, if there are operational considerations, if the information in certain fields was not available. Number 3, if the proposed fields are representative of an operationally actionable data set assembled for a CDM. Number 4, if there are any proposed fields that are considered to be not necessary. And number 5, if there are additional fields that should be included in the proposed list. So I mentioned those at the beginning, but I'm summarizing them again here because we just walked through the data tables, and it's just important to capture that in closing. And next slide, please. We have 2 items where we're particularly interested in comments. If you remember the reference frame comment, not comment, but discussion that I mentioned on that slide, the Office of Space Commerce is proposing the default reference frames of the EME 2000 for the position and velocity, and also the RTN UVW with rotation term for covariance. So questions that we would like the community to consider are there significant operational impacts to the community if such reference frames are the default? And are there alternative reference frames that OSC should consider as the default? And if so, why? So we welcome your feedback there. And then also drawing attention back to those fields marked with an asterisk. So they were in table 2 for this presentation. And we welcome feedback about the operational impacts if such information is not included in a CDM. So those are the fields with the asterisk. And lastly, next slide, please. I'd just like to give acknowledgements to the teams that worked on the proposal and the review of this information from the Office of Space Commerce, as well as the Aerospace Corporation and MITRE Corporation working with us, and the U.S. Space Force, and our NOAA office as well. So thank you very much, and I'll turn the floor back over to Christine. We can stop sharing the slides.
Thank you, Diane. So for those that haven't joined us before, you can utilize in the GoToWebinar feature the raise hand feature. I will call on people in the order that they have their hands raised to give verbal comment. You will have a maximum of 3 minutes to submit a verbal comment, and I will be unmuting, giving folks the ability to unmute as able when I call on you. And for reference, the handout is also, with going in depth into all these different fields, is listed in the handouts tab and also in the chat as well. So if you have verbal comment that you would like to submit, you can use the raise hand feature. One second, I'm seeing them coming through. So Dan Altroghi, you can now unmute.
Okay, thanks. You can hear me?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
So just a couple of comments. First one is the, just a second, please.
Yeah, let me.
Yeah, so the new version, I just wanted to comment briefly on that. David Barry would have better insight into this, but that really is making great progress, and we expect it out to be published pretty soon. It's under agency review right now, I believe. But one thing that is beneficial from that is there was a special emphasis on this new development to make sure it's backwards compatible, unless absolutely impossible to do so. And I think by and large it is. And so that will help OSC moving forward, because I understand, why you're selecting the current published version for now, but the way that you're going about, moving off of comments into established fields as the new one comes online, I think is a really good idea. The second point is this new version does address probably 20 separate deficiencies that the DoD and NASA and international space agencies had raised with this current version. So I think as that gets published and online, I think as you can have some flexibility to transition over to that, I think again, the DoD and NASA will find that useful, as will the international community. And the last comment is on the reference frame that's mentioned with EME, equator mean equinox frame. There's always a question, and I ran into this even this week, is that of date, is it of epoch? It depends on the implementer and the details. And the suggestion I had from Dave Velato that I'm working with is that we just use J2000 as the definition, because that ambiguity of epoch versus date goes away. Over.
Thank you, Dan, for that feedback. I'll be taking it back to our technical team. I'll also note that we did put in the chat a link to the Pinkfoot 1.1.1 that was recently uploaded, I believe this week, to the CCSDS website for broad review. And what we're presenting today is what we had evaluated in terms of what was currently in use by the 19th Space Defense Squadron for the purposes of design decisions for tracks. But I do want to call out to folks online that there is a recent version draft standard that's currently on this, was recently posted to the CCSDS website, and that is in the chat as well. So next I see Doug Engelhardt. You should now be able to unmute.
Thanks, Christine. Doug Engelhardt from Maxar. We certainly request that the asterisk fields for the tracking information be retained in the CDM. This gives us important information insight into the quality and accuracy of the OD, orbit determination solution. We also then request an additional field in that sub area for the CDM. We request a new field be added to indicate a sensor tasking level for each object. Typically, the concern is for the secondary object, especially for a sparsely tracked debris object, which is common. The originator of the CDM would have a method for assigning tasking priority of its sensors, and their method may or may not be publicized or published, and they may not want to fill in that field. That's their prerogative, but it would be useful for operators to even have a minimum amount of information. For example, just the fact that tasking has been assessed and increased for an uncertain and potentially threatening object. These cases, the probability of collision is diluted due to a large positional uncertainty. So we as operators obviously are interested in seeing the uncertainties reduced, and an observational update is the best way to do that. We can't change a debris object's trajectory, of course, but it can be better determined with more tracking, and that information influences our course of action for collision avoidance. Having that field in the CDM is a clear, clean way to communicate the intent of the tracking provider, and can keep the operator apprised of the tasking level with every CDM update up through TCA. Again, they may not publish, that may not be available, they may not publish that, but just knowing the priority has been increased over a default factory setting or catalog maintenance setting, that would be helpful. The mechanism in any case would be there and available. especially for use by upcoming commercial tracking data providers. Thank you.
Doug, if I could ask a follow-up question to make sure I'm understanding the feedback correctly. In terms of the new proposed field, would an example, the level of fidelity for an example of how that field be filled out would be not necessarily quantitative, but more qualitative in terms of whether there is additional tasking or whether that additional tasking is increasing or decreasing. Did I capture that correctly?
Yes, it can be flexible. As I mentioned, any information is good. Quantitative would be better if it could refer back to a published algorithm, tasking level 1, 2, 3, and that would be that index or scale would be known and published of what that means, and the operator could see that it has been increased. Or at a minimum, something qualitative, as you mentioned, just the fact that it's been assessed and it is being increased, or not. That would be useful.
Thank you for clarifying. So next I see Ryan Shepard. You should now be able to unmute, Ryan.
Okay, Ryan Shepard from Iridium. First of all, I'd just like to say that I greatly appreciate that you are using the current CDM as provided by the 18th and 19th Space Defense Squadron as kind of the template for moving forward, because that should certainly help with a smooth transition. Secondly, the comment fields that are included from the current CDM, that's also appreciative, especially the DCP density forecast uncertainty information, which is important for covariance decorrelation that Iridium uses. That's a particular field that we would like to maintain in the CDM. And I guess the fact that people are using these comment fields is probably a pretty good indication that they should become standard fields and not just comments. And among those, I think probably only apogee, perigee, and inclination are arguably calculatable outside of the data. The rest are fairly important. As far as the fields marked with an asterisk, I really did appreciate Doug's comments about the tasking information, which could indeed be helpful. I would go on to say that if too many of the fields that are marked with asterisks are not provided, that would tend to lower the confidence of an operator in the data. Level of trust is lower, and there would be a assumption that something is trying to be hidden in the data if too many of those values are missing. Among those, I did notice that like ballistic coefficient information, CDA, was marked with an asterisk. Mass was not, which I found curious if the mass was always going to be provided, given that the secondary objects, usually you have to make some judgments about what the mask is, attempting to derive it from ballistic coefficient information. So I guess I would just be a question back to you as to what the intention is there. I would point out that if the mass is provided, then maybe the ballistic coefficient information is less important. However, that it is being used currently to come up with a statistical range of possible masses for the secondary object, which is used for collision consequences. So it would be important to maintain some level of information there. And I think that's about all I have to say, other than I do appreciate that we're trying to move forward with a smooth transition here and not disrupting things too much.
Thank you, Ryan, for your feedback. And yes, that is actually one of our prime objectives through the development of TraCSS, is to try and minimize any disruptions to the operator community. Thus, why we do try to hold these public listening sessions. For anyone who just recently joined, you can see the handout in the Handouts tab or in the chat as well regarding the proposed fields for track CDMs. And if you would like to pose a question that I can take back to our technical team or provide feedback, please utilize the raise hand feature in GoToWebinar. Next, we have Samayak Hassan. You should be able to now unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And yeah, I echo the what was said earlier in terms of start basically working off of the existing CCSDS standards. That'll definitely make the process smooth. I'm Siam Akasar from Kiana Space, by the way. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I have few questions regarding this format. First off, Ryan just talked about mass. I agree. There seems to be a little bit of a redundancy between mass and ballistic coefficients. So that may be needed some more discussions in terms of how to decorrelate those two parameters and quantities. And another question regarding mass is, obviously, if we are talking about debris objects and we estimate their mass, it's going to be constant. But when we are talking about operational satellites and as they use fuel, especially if they are conventional propulsion system, that's going to change the mass over time. So what is my question is, what's the mechanism by which OSC is planning to keep track of the mass? And finally, my last question is about specifically the size of the objects. There seemed to be some redundancy again in the information because I see, and this is a little bit of an issue in the existing CDMs as well, that we have exclusion radius versus area PC versus hard body radius of the object. And all these are referring to the same quantity, which is the size of the object by which we are calculating the PC. And but there seems to be conflicting information, or rather redundancy there. So I think there needs to be more analysis there to be done to make sure those are decorrelated, or if they are redundant, we can only use one quantity just to ensure that everyone, there's no confusion what quantity was used to calculate the PC. That's all.
Thank you very much. I do want to, I will take your question, yours and Ryan's question regarding the mass back to our technical team. I did want to point out one aspect in terms of some of these terms in reference, for example, to the fields F and asterisk, where information is may not be distributable or available to the track system to be able to include in the CDM. For example, in this table 1 or other like mass or other object fields where the information is publicly available, that would allow us to put in the CDM. Additionally, there's some fields where, for example, maneuverable, our proposal is to put in that field what the owner-operator inputted status when they submit registration for their satellite into TraCSS. This is the proposal or idea. Would welcome feedback that this would be reflected in the field in terms of can or cannot maneuver, for example. So welcome feedback on this area as well. I'm not actually seeing new hands raised. So again, want to, oh, I see another one coming in, but I again want to raise that if you have a question or feedback you'd like to give, please utilize the raise hand function, or if you gave prior comment or feedback and would like to give additional feedback and there is no other new person in the queue, that comment or feedback will be taken during this session as well. But first, next I see David Barry. You should now be able to unmute.
Okay, yes, I was waiting until other folks had commented. Since, as the chair of the CCSTS Navigation Working Group, I was very interested to hear what other folks had to say, to be able to respond to them to a certain extent. So I have a couple of comments. One is that there was a reference to the P-1.0.1 being under formal review. It's not, that was the very first draft of the update, and so it's a couple of years old. I saw, Christine, you had said you had received the CDM P-1.0.7. That is really almost equivalent to the version being reviewed formally, because it was the last formal, the last draft prepared by the working group. Now, in a couple of the slides, it refers to a B-15. I don't know where that came from. B-1 is the only official Blue Book standard. There may have been, say, a superscript or something like that that was transferred into an actual digit of a 5. But B-1 is the only official version of the CDM at this point. I think it was on slide 2 that showed up. Another comment is that I noticed that you indicated you'd be using the Blue Book version 1 until the Blue Book version 2 is available. That's probably a good idea because your developers are probably already working on it. Unfortunately, the CCSTS has processes that have some time constraints that are not within the control of the working group. And so my benchmark is that once the document leaves the working group's hands, there's typically about a year until it appears as a standard, because there are a lot of things that go on in the back end. I call it the end game. I've argued that we need to figure out how to make that shorter. I have a couple of ideas that I will propose to the CCSTS Secretariat about compressing that period. There are some things that are within our control as a working group, and one of those is a period of prototyping that has to occur, where people develop prototypes of the new version and test it, and essentially prove that it's implementable. So I was wondering, since you have a development team working on CDMs now, a TraCSS could be one of the 2 prototypes that the CCSTS requires in order to complete the testing of the proposed standard. So that's something you might consider with your technical team. If they prepared a prototype of the version 2, what will become the version 2 Blue Book, you'd be able to transition rapidly with the tested version that you have in-house. That's something for you to consider. I can't do anything about that per se, but I do anticipate that on a normal schedule, February of 2025 would be the approximate date of a publication of the Blue Book version 2, unless we're able to fast track it in some ways that are not defined officially in the CCSTS procedures. One other note, Ryan, it was interesting to hear you comment, because I think you were you did some prototyping on the original version of the Blue Book, if I recall correctly. I did check back in my notes, and there was someone named Ryan Shepard that did participate in the prototyping, so I appreciate that and your continued interest. Let's see.
David, if
am I out of time?
would it be okay if I just for this moment, but we can come back to you after I let someone new speak for their allotted time, and then we can come back.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. So next I see Anthony Corey. You should now be able to unmute.
Hi. It's TJ. Given that last comment, and I've talked to Matt Murray before about this, I feel remiss to say that I would be remiss not to say I think the solution is what I've set up on spacedatastandards.org, which is you set up a system that has open comments on an open GitHub site where people can take the CCSDS standards, create platform independent IDLs, interface description language documents, which look like the CCSDS standards, automatically generate source code from those, let developers use that source code for versioning, and as changes come in upstream from CCSDS on their timetable, update those accordingly. This way you have rolling documentation, automatically generated source code so development teams can start working with it right now, as well as a way to do versioning changes when new versions come out in a orderly fashion as you're doing things like database migrations or whatnot. So you will have those. The problem with using things like comment fields and updating things asynchronously is that what will happen is people will implement those ad hoc fields and comment fields their own way, whatever that is. And then when it's time to actually update the standards, you're going to have a large disagreement between integrators on what that means. So it's going to be very hard to orderly migrate to the new versions. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and as always, I'm standing by. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ. I'll make sure that gets back to our technical team. I'll return back to David Barry, and then it'll be Doug Engelhardt. David, real quick, I had a clarifying question regarding your earlier feedback regarding TraCSS prototyping a standard. Was that in reference to the P-1.1.1 that was just put up on the CCSDS website for review this week, or for a different draft? Over.
Okay, so the process is that there's a 2-month agency review, which one of the things that I could propose to the Secretariat is that they reduce it to 1 month. They're not a fan of that. They say 2-month minimum. But at the end of that 2-month period, we would prototype a version that includes review comments that were formally accepted. So in other words, the version that's currently in review, we probably would not, it would not be the final prototype if we were to prototype it. You understand what I mean? Because there'll be, I responded to your question earlier about, are there lots of changes? And I said that it varies widely. We recently published another updated document that had major changes in it. We received 0 review comments, zero literally. So it went and was published with no changes. In the original version of the CDM, we had over 100 review items, comments. About 2/3 of those were accepted. And so the version that we prototyped was the one that included the responses to all the accepted RIDs. So in about 2 months, we'll be able to prototype or start prototyping the version that includes any accepted review comments from the current review of the P-1.1 that was just put into review. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Right. Am I still on, or is it?
You've got, I can give you 1 more minute. I do want to give some other folks a chance to respond
Sure.
before we're at the end of the hour.
Let me just say that in my opinion, the best way for participants to provide the feedback is to put in a formal comment via the site that you have in the chat section of the webinar.
Thank you very much for your feedback. Next, we'll have Doug Engelhardt, and then after that, David Goldstein, and that may bring us to the end of the listening session. But Doug, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. With a little bit of extra time, I'd like to comment on the maneuverability field. It was mentioned earlier that indicates whether the operator has specified whether they're maneuverable or not. But I would suggest that be expanded. I'm expecting that there'll be an application or a capability within TraCSS in the future to determine maneuverability. In any case, whether the operator specifies it or not, just based on previous tracking, the maneuvers can be determined. And that would be useful to have that indicated that the maneuverability has been determined. And also the time of the last maneuver in that case would be useful. These are things that the operator can go off and find at in a separate location, but it would be convenient and useful to have them right there in the CDM. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Doug. Next, we have David Goldstein. You should now be able to unmute. Give us 1 second. Goldie, if you're still online, you should now be able to unmute.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for doing these listening sessions. Although they're sometimes sort of talking sessions for us, not as much listening. We'd like to be able to provide like written comments if that's possible too. And but just a few thoughts today. One is it'd be great if there was just one area field for the bodies that are used instead of with the CDMs today. There are several different areas that are provided, and so sort of scoping that down might be good. One other idea would be to add an event ID as opposed to just the CDM ID, whereby all of the CDMs that would be associated with one conjunction event, even though they would be generated at different creation times, could be aligned to one event, one conjunction event. And we can chat about that more if you need to. On the comment field, it ends up being a bit challenging in the JSON format with comments. And so if you could think through maybe a standardized way to either add underscores where the spaces are, to be able to sort of deduplicate those comments when the JSON format is used. And then the last one is if I think that I agree with Dan on the coordinate frame to use, but it would also be great if you could provide a quaternion rotation from the inertial frame to the fixed frame, because everybody's probably going to end up doing that anyway. And so having that rotation already done saves everybody time and the trouble of matching. Anyway, that's all the comments I have for today.
Thank you very much for that feedback. We do have a couple minutes left. I wanted to check real quick. Ryan Shepard, I just saw your hand had been still raised. Did you have additional feedback? I saw his hand just went down. David Barry, did you have additional feedback that you wanted to provide? I see that your hand is still raised.
I thought I had lowered it, but I did put into the chat there my my comment about the best way to get us something in that the CCSDS NAV working group can consider is to go to that site you have in the chat and enter a review comment. So there's been some good comments in today's session, and we appreciate that. And finally, the comment on the reference frame, that was very interesting. Dan Altraghi has heard this story before because he's in the working group, but about 50% of the discussions that we had when we created the first version of the CDM was about reference frames. And there was a general notion that having one selected version, as you've done with TraCSS, or recommending anyway, was the best way. The problem was we could not get people to agree on what that one was. So there are three, as a result, there are three reference frames that are in the CDM for use. Now, I believe that many people are using, in fact, EME 2000, and it is referenced to the J2000 date in the standard. So pursuant to one of the comments we heard, that there is a common date associated with that. That's it for me. Great session.
Thank you. I see, Goldie, your hand is still raised. Did you have additional feedback? If not, so thank you all for joining us today. I do see that we have some additional questions in the question box and in the chat. Those will be taken back to our technical team, and we do appreciate your feedback. For again, listed in the handout section and at the top of the chat is a link to the handout that describes in depth the different proposed fields that we're considering for a TraCSS CDM. If you would like to provide written comment, you can do so via there's instructions in the handout, and you can also email them to tracs.commerce@noaa.gov, and that will be taken to our technical team for consideration about as well. But thank you all for your time and attention. We really do value your feedback here at the TraCSS team, as this helps us as we're making the design decisions for TraCSS. We are very intent on taking an agile development approach and making sure that we are minimizing disruptions to the operator community and making sure that we're not impacting spaceflight safety services while also building to provide a civil capability that will also help advance the state of the art for SSA as well. So I appreciate your time and attention. This recording, a recording of this session will be posted online at the TraCSS website, likely in a couple of days for later viewing. If you're interested in listening and seeing the feedback again. Thank you again, and we will be closing the listening session. Oh, and thank you to Dr. Diane Poster as well for her leadership in putting together this proposal and walking us through some very detailed technical information. So thank you.